It's really cute. Guys, I might cry. I might cry. It's was that what it said to my students? Okay. Yay.
Okay, Blair.
That's nice.
Robin, come in. Okay, let me get this three section. All right, here we go. Then I can.
This is really cute. I don't think I was in it.
Look at it on the 3 seconds. Okay, good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Welcome to the plenary on Black women's resistance. We want to get started to make sure that we have an ample amount of time for question and answer at the end of our conversation. Speakers will be in conversation around questions that we pose to each other. And then there will be time at the end for audience engagement. So I want to start out with the bios in alphabetical order. Natanya Duncan is the Director of Africana Studies at Queens College, City University of New York, where she's an Associate Professor of History. A historian of the African diaspora, her research and teaching focuses on global freedom movements of the 20th and 21st century. Duncan's research interest includes constructions of identity and nation building amongst women of color, migrations, color and class and diasporic communities, and the engagements of intellectuals throughout the African diaspora. Her forthcoming book, An Efficient Womanhood, Women and the Making of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, focuses on the distinct activist strategies enacted by women in the Universal Negro Improvement Association, UNIA, which Duncan has called an efficient womanhood. Following the ways women in the UNIA scripted their own understandings of Pan-Africanism, Black nationalism, and constructions of diasporic Blackness, the work traces the blending of nationalist and gendered concerns amongst known and lesser known Garveyite women. Dr. Duncan has written several important essays, including ones that explore leadership models of UNIA women, and include Now in Charge of the American Field, Mamie Demina and Charting the UNIA's New Course in the Journal of Liberty Hall, Henrietta Vincent Davis, The Lady of the Race in the Journal of New York History, and Laura Kofi and the Reverse Atlantic Experience in the American South and the Atlantic World. Our second speaker, or panelist, we can say, Blair L.M. Kelly. Dr. Kelly is the Joel R. Williamson Distinguished Professor of Southern Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and the director of the Center for the Study of the American South, the first Black woman to serve in that role in the center's 30-year history. Kelly is the author of 2 books. The first, Right to Ride, Streetcar Boycotts and African American Citizenship, UNC Press, was awarded the 2010 Letitia Woods Brown Memorial Prize from the Association of Black Women's Historians. Kelly's newest book, Black Folk, The Root of Black Working Class, was awarded a 2020 Creative Nonfiction Grant by the Whiting Foundation and the 2022-23 John Hope Franklin NEH Fellowship by the National Humanities Center. Kelly received her BA from the University of Virginia in History and African American Studies. She earned her MA and PhD in History and graduate certificates in African and African American Studies and Women's Studies at Duke University. I'm going to introduce myself. Robin C. Spencer Antoine's research and teaching focuses on Black social protest after World War II, urban and working class radicalism, and gender. Her book, The Revolution Has Come, Black Power, Gender, and the Black Panther Party in Oakland, was published in 2016. She is co-founder of the Intersectional Black Panther Party History Project and has written widely on gender and Black power. She's received awards from her work from the Mellon Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the Association of Black Women's Historians. She's currently a fellow at Harvard's Warren Center, finishing a book on the intersections between the movement for Black liberation and the movement against the US war in Vietnam. In addition, she's working on 2 biographies of radical women. The first, a biography of radical activist, scholar, and thinker, Angela Davis, and the second, a biography of Patricia Murphy Robinson, Black feminist psychotherapist who retired in Jacksonville, Florida in the 1990s. Our next presenter, Dr. Eula Taylor. Dr. Eula Taylor earned her doctorate in American history from UC Santa Barbara. She's the author of The Promise of Patriarchy, Women and the Nation of Islam, The Veiled Garvey, The Life and Times of Amy Jacks Garvey, and co-author of Panther, A Pictorial History of the Black Panther Party and the Story Behind the Film, and co-editor of Black California Dreamin', The Crisis of California African American Communities. Her articles on African American women's history and feminist theory have appeared in a number of academic journals and edited volumes. She is most proud, however, of her former students who are transforming the field of Black studies. And finally, we have Dr. Jasmine Young. Dr. Young is currently a visiting scholar at Harvard's Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History, where she's completing her manuscript, Black Women in Armed Resistance, SNCC, and the Black Liberation Struggle, which explores Black women's extensive practice and advocacy of armed resistance. Her research interests center on the intellectual history of Black women, state violence and resistance, and radical Black feminism. Dr. Young earned her PhD in history from Rutgers University, New Brunswick, and also holds 2 master's degrees, one from Columbia University in African American Studies, and another in gender studies from the London School of Economics. Welcome to our plenary. We look forward to engaging you in the question and answer period, and I look forward to the conversation amongst us as panelists. Thank you.
It is so amazing to be here with all of you. And it is so amazing to be here on this panel with my colleagues who have written and thought about Black women and resistance and helped to create new intellectual paths in the field of Black women's history. I thought it would be good if we could begin by all of us just providing a snapshot, a window into our current research projects. So we'll start with Jasmine.
Good afternoon. Is this on? All right. Good afternoon, folks. Y'all all right? Good. So as Robin mentioned, I'm currently working on a project that looks at Black women in armed resistance in the civil rights and Black power era. I'm interested in exploring their experiences of state violence, white vigilante violence, racial and sexual violence that really makes them come to the conclusion that armed resistance is necessary for Black liberation. They're looking at their experiences both collectively and individually and coming to these conclusions. Part of what I'm doing in the work is thinking about armed resistance broadly, right? So one can be armed with a pistol, certainly, but one can also be armed with a pen. If you've ever walked down the street, with keys in your hand, in between your fingers, you know what I mean. So the women that I'm exploring are armed in various ways, and they're practicing various aspects of armed resistance, meaning they're practicing self-defense. Sometimes they are advocating for retaliatory violence against white vigilante violence or state repression. Sometimes they're participating in urban rebellions and insurrections, and other times they're advocating or participating in political violence. So the work is really looking at these women who are in these various organizations and are advocating and practicing armed resistance. And it looks at women who are in SNCC and then who go off into these other organizations like the Black Panther Party, the BLA, the Republic of New Africa. So that's the work.
Hi, good afternoon. First, I want to just thank my fellow panelists for allowing me to share this space with them. I have two current projects that actually build on my work on women in the Universal Negro Improvement Association. That research started out as a UNCF Mellon Fellow project in undergrad 27 years ago. And so in that time, I married myself to the archive and to the various spaces that these women appeared in, and discovered that they were very busy working. And in that work, they sometimes encountered challenges that caused them to have to negotiate or renegotiate how they approached dealing with some of the oppressions that they faced, both from government entities, community entities, and even in their own homes. And so my current project is one, documenting the women poets and women writers who contributed to the Negro World newspaper. And in doing that, I came across a woman named Ethel True Dunlap, who happened to be the most prolific of the Negro World poets. And she also happened to be a white woman. And for me, that raised questions about allyship and my own ideas about this efficient womanhood that UNIA women practice as a form of activism. And efficient womanhood really asks persons to form partnerships or alliances that would promote the goals of the organization. And the main goal of the organization was self-autonomy for Black people. In addition, their activism included peer mentorship and intergenerational mentorship. And lastly, their activism included putting their money where their mouth is and serving as economic and social bridge builders, a term that I borrowed from Professor Belinda Robinette, who writes about women's roles in the nascent civil rights movement. In exploring the poets of the Negro world and Ethel True Dunlap, I also came across children who wrote for the Negro world and appeared on its pages, one of which was Sylvia Woods, who grew up to be a politician in Chicago, originally from New Orleans, grew up in a UNIA home, grew up with a Garveyite father who took her to the UNIA meetings. And at every meeting, a woman would stand to read from the Negro world. And one of her earliest memories at the age of 6, she says in a autobiographical essay, was her father leaning into her ear during a meeting and saying, "I want you to speak like that woman. I want you to hear like that woman. I want you to walk like that woman." And that raised this question for me about the ways in which we understand what it means to model and be an exemplar for those who are in our immediate circle and the kind of legacy and path that we leave. I, in my work, deal with the ways in which UNIA women pushed against some of the gender norms of the period, successfully, I might add, but also with the notion and the idea that the work that they engaged in was a work that had a cost. And that brings me to a quote from Anna Julia Cooper that I actually have it on my office door because I think I had to help her finish it. I arrogant a little bit about this, but you'll understand when I read it. According to Professor Anna Julia Cooper, the fundamental agency under God in the regeneration and the retraining of the race, as well as the groundwork and starting point of its progress upward, must be the Black woman. And for me, I add underneath it, because of what I learned about the strategies that UNIA women engaged in, I've added to it, but we must not let it kill us. And so to me, my work is not just about resistance, it's about persistence, it's about care of self, care of community, and the protection of our legacy. The essential work that the women of the UNIA performed, in my mind, was that they took the time to write everything down. Thank you.
So currently, I don't think it's on. Is it on?
It's on.
They put it on. I should start talking. Okay, great. My name is Blair Kelly, as you all heard in the introduction, and I have a book that just came out. It's not on. Hello, my name is Blair Kelly. I have a book that just came out. And so this question is a difficult one because I'm like, am I still working on it? Because I am still working on it and I'm in the middle of it in terms of speaking and talking about it and sharing it with the world. It's called Black Folk. And then I was asked to consider what is the Black working class? And so I began to answer that question by thinking about my family and the stories that my mother, my grandfather, my father, my grandmother passed to me. And so for me, one of the questions that Black folk is asking of what it means to be Black and working class is, what does it mean for Black women to take up work in a very unique set of circumstances, in circumstances that are not parallel to the lives of white women in those same kinds of roles, but have a unique set of challenges, but also have unique gifts and a unique legacy that they inherit. So often we are thinking about Black womanhood as deficit of what we don't have, of the gaps, of the spaces, of the struggles. But I think it's also important to remember what Black women have had and what we have. That we come from a unique set of circumstances that make us a particular kind of people, and that we pass those things down to our children, and we continue to do that work in spite of the sort of lack that one would see if you looked at it from just a straight capitalist lens, right? You would see what Black women don't have. But instead, by focusing on what Black women did, I began to think about their skills, about the training that they passed down mother to daughter, I write about washerwomen. I write about domestic workers. My great-grandmother was a laundress. My grandmother was a domestic worker, both before and after the Great Migration. And when I look at their stories and when I look at the stories of the oral histories and the archival stories that I'm collecting and digging through to talk about Black folk, their brilliance in strategy, their choices, their reliance on community and connection as a power, their wisdom about what power they had as a class. They didn't need to be taught by anybody how to organize a union or think collectively. They didn't need their consciousness raised by some outsider. They came into freedom understanding the world in very particular ways. They were wise, they were poor, they didn't have much, they didn't make much, but they were wise. And so often when we think about people who are working class, people who don't make much money, we are discounting as a society what they have. And so for me, Black folk is a reframing and a reclamation of the riches that Black women and men carried with them through this story. And so it's been a fulfilling journey to share that and to be doing the work of Black folk. So I'm going to continue that in my future projects. I'm thinking of a book called Good Job, and which pushes forward narratives in the next few decades that my parents' generation, rather than my grandparents' generation, which is the focus of Black folk. And I think I have about 4 books I would like to write before I stop working. So I won't tell you all that. Nope.
I tried. Okay. I'm working on, is this?
No.
I would just want to flag that we're having some issues to the tech team, because I think it's going to be pretty hard to navigate around these few things. Okay. So the question of what are we working on? What are we thinking about? Well, right now I have a few projects that I am engaged with. My major project now is thinking about Black women and men and the ways in which that they spoke back to U.S. foreign policy in the 1960s and 1970s. In particular, I'm interested in the U.S. war in Vietnam and the ways in which, through the lens of solidarity and transnational politics, Black men and women came together to make a challenge to U.S. foreign policy using the ways in which they were already engaged in domestic dissent. So I look at a broad range of actors, from blues musicians to poets to people engaged in radical political organizations, in order to bring to the fore a cast of characters who can exemplify the way that Black people thought about peace, the way that they thought about the world and saw themselves as part of that world and had a vision for the world that included other people of color as well. During the course of that research, I encountered many different individuals, including one person who became their own book project, Patricia Murphy Robinson. She was a Black psychotherapist. She was a Marxist. She actually retired here in Jacksonville, Florida in the 1990s. And looking at her work within movements as a theorist around the role of class and capitalism in oppression and resistance, looking at the way that she centralized emotions, feelings, health as part of activist concerns, not just in terms of something to resist to get, but something to prefigure in one's life as a way of making structural transformation. So I'm interested in those questions. I think, especially during the first wave of our ongoing pandemic, thinking about someone who was invested in larger questions of health and connecting it to capitalism was a very important intervention for me. And as part of that, I'm interested in her collection practice. As Dr. Kelly mentioned, just thinking through moving away from this deficit model to the abundant way that Black women sought to preserve their own history and to archive themselves in motion and to use their intellect to break down barriers and to start within their family, within their neighborhood, within their schools, and to continually move outward. Those are the questions that I am concerned about. And I think they sort of have a lot of contemporary implications.
Is it working? Wonderful. I am currently writing what I'm calling an oral memoir of a woman named Frances M. Beale. Frances M. Beale was a former member of SNCC. She was a co-founder of the Third World Women's Alliance. She was a journalist. She worked for the National Council of Black Studies, the ACLU. And so I'm interested in how does a working single mother figure out how to be a revolutionary, figures out how to work with other people who are equally committed to creating a world that they want their daughters to be able to live in. I'm calling it an oral memoir because Fran Beale still lives in Oakland with me, and I have spent about 7 years interviewing her. And so she is really part of this process. At the same time, I am leaning into archives where I am meditating on how she remembers her past. And so this is the book that I'm working on.
This is like a horrible setup for Black women to be in conversation with each other. It doesn't allow for the gumbo yaya conversation where we can talk with each other, over each other, but that's okay. Here we are, y'all. So I want us to kind of start by thinking about and sharing how we are in conversation with each other's work. Maybe you think about your intellectual genealogy, and of course, what the direction of the field, right, of Black women's history. Certainly biography is still central to that, as we kind of see on this panel today, but what directions do you see the field going in, and what are you excited about? So there's a few questions in there, but have at it.
This one's working? Yeah. I think what's powerful for me is that oftentimes I'm thinking of my forebears, not necessarily as the people who, make you in school and are your mentors in everyday life, but the people you read and the people whose work resonates with you, and who you go to again and again as those guides. So I want to call the names of Elsa Barkley Brown, of Tara Hunter, of Robin D.G. Kelly, of Toni Morrison, people whose work I read continuously, read again and go back because, you're always in different places with your own work. And so you glean different things from them. And what's been powerful in all their work is a privileging of an everyday life and the meaning and strength and the political in those spaces, giving me the space to think about ideas that I haven't seen delineated anywhere else, thinking about something that I call the politics of joy, right? The sense that the joy that Black people have is not a happiness necessarily, particularly facing oftentimes the unthinkable, but the ways in which They have joy in spite of sorrow. The kind the world didn't give and the world can't take away. And that's something unique, a unique kernel that I see in all their work, that I am trying to craft new ways of knowing about the world. The archive is insufficient for what we want to do and what we want to know about Black women. And so what are the other archives we can build? What are the ways in which we can respond to creating new archives, which my colleagues are brilliantly doing? So for me, if, 5 years ago, everyone had the word "the archive" on their talks, because we were speaking to that lack and the absence. And now we are doing the projects of making those archives that we would want to see, of cataloging the work, seeing your paper yesterday talking about the library, the placement of art and articles and notes and those kinds of things. How are we intervening in those processes of making what we know? For me, as an oral historian, how am I recording? What questions am I asking of my subjects? What do I want to know? And not just sort of those grand things, but those everyday things. The texture of everyday life is so important for our survival, for our thriving, for the building of community. And so that's what I've really been able to glean from them, and what I see and excited about from my colleagues.
Thank you for that. Well, let me not be too hopeful. I'm feeling just a lot here, it's amazing to be together on this plenary. There's so many rooms that we enter where you're the only one, and you're told over and over again that, without being said, that the work that you're doing is unimportant, it's lesser than, etc. So it's just a beautiful thing to be on a plenary like this, flanked by so many of the people that influenced me. I want to call out the Association of Black Women Historians. I remember getting just the Truth newsletter when it was a piece of paper thing that was mailed out to you, and it had little articles. And Elsa Barkley Brown and Carol Boyce Davies were my teachers when I was an undergraduate student at SUNY Binghamton. And I feel like I learned so much that I didn't even know I needed at the time, from those two scholars. And in particular, I want to call out the journal Sage. All of these brilliant spaces and places where Black women intellectuals came together to talk about things. I remember this article from Dr. Elsa Barkley Brown, Mothers of the Mind, where she talked about just getting up at an association, giving a speech, and her relationship with her mother and her mother as a historian, and ways of knowing. I feel like that is what I'm excited about in Black women's history, is this focus on ways of knowing, and what Dr. Kelly's doing in her most recent book, like acknowledging that we have what we need, at the kitchen table, that Black women have built an intellectual foundation, like Dr. Duncan has so brilliantly shown in her work, that can be part of the conversation. Somehow Black women intellects somehow don't ever define a field, right? It's some other thing that's such and such thought, right? But to think about how Black women provided so many blueprints, in so many ways, all different types of women who didn't have formal education and things like that, who simply collected their stuff or put it on a quilt or told it in a story. So those are the things that excite me about New Directions. I also want to call out this personal political divide. The woman I'm working on, Patricia Murphy Robinson, she would always say the political is personal. And too often we focus on the exterior politics and we don't look at that interiority. And I see that that's a really brilliant and beautiful direction that Black women's history is going in to get to Black women's way deep down insides, how they thought, what they felt, the challenges, the opportunities, the joys, the pains, the ways in which they sustained themselves and their bodies. The woman I'm working on was a swimmer, and the ways that that practice, just totally transformed. And there's so many brilliant scholars to call out who are doing that work. So those are the things that I'm excited about in terms of directions in the field.
Thank you. This is an interesting question for me because I see myself and my work in conversation with two generations of scholars. So when you ask me about my intellectual genealogy, I want to take a moment and salute Asalh and ABWH for what it has done in my life as an academic. I'm having a moment because I'm on a plenary with Eula Taylor. Eula Taylor was a commentator of my first Asalh paper 20 years ago. And this is a real full circle moment. So my intellectual genealogy is sitting up here. My work in the field and my discovery of myself as a Black feminist historian came from my relationships with Dr. Rosalind Terborg Penn and her work on Black women in the diaspora and African-American women's history. In her work, she posits this idea of the value of fictive kin relationships. And those relationships not only build community on a local level, but they build community on a global scale, and they build community in institutions. And the Association of Black Women Historians, for which she is a co-founder, along with Dr. Darlene Clark-Hine, Dr. Betty Collier-Thomas, and others, has served as a grooming space for my generation of scholars. And so my work in part answers questions that they raised and continues dialogues that they started on Black women's activism, respectability politics. How do we set a standard and definition for ourselves that allows us to include women who are both formally and informally educated? And with that, I have to say that my work then allows me to be in conversation with my sister scholars. And I'm just going to say some names because I think it's important that as a member of the movement, Cite Black Women, that I do so. So my work is in conversation with Sister Brittany Cooper, who's the author of Eloquent Rage, because I believe that as the UNIA women took the time to write everything down, they were not only raging, they were also setting the stage for people like me to come in and pick up the mantle. I'm also in conversation with persons like Allison Parker, who've taken the time to write biographies that not only discuss the political work of Mary Church Terrell, but Mary Church Terrell, the human being, the woman, the mother, the life of a lover and a caregiver. And then I'm in conversation with persons like Nikki Taylor and KT Ewing and Tiffany Gill, who asked us to look at the archive, not as a building or a static space, but an archive that exists in the bedrooms and parlors and gardens of our mothers, our aunts, and our sisters. I'm also in conversation with people like Ashley Farmer and Ashley Preston and Anandra Nelson, who have guided us into looking at how we construct our idea of diasporic activism, both from an African-American woman standpoint and an African and Afro-Caribbean woman standpoint. And then I am also in conversation with persons like Shanette Garrett-Scott, Nikki Brown, and Cheryl Hicks, whose work actually says to us, let us think about the ways in which Black women not only made money, but how they chose to spend it. Let's not just talk about how Black women were washerwomen and day laborers and school teachers, but let's talk about the institutions and organizations and ways that they sowed seeds to build schools, like Crystal Saunders has pointed out to us, the ways in which they built organizations and service churches and lodges. And so I see my work as intergenerational in nature. And as a result, it allows me to get back to the work, for example, of Dr. Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, and this idea of what it means to be a woman in a Baptist union, a Baptist convention, that then creates a legacy, a space, a rhetoric for other women to pick up on and use to build other organizations at the local level that have much larger implications for other generations.
Let's see. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Wonderful. We're going to work on that in the audience. And and I have to tell you, I feel a little weepy up here. You know, I've known most of these young women since they were graduate students. And just to see their scholarship blossom and just transform the field of Black women's history. And then to look at all of you out here, many of whom I also knew as graduate students, you know, writing multiple books, tearing up the field. It's amazing. And I'm so thankful to witness it. When I think about my own intellectual genealogy, it's a little bit different. You know, 30 years in the game. Okay. A little bit different, but E. Frances White was very, very important to my thinking. She was one of the early scholars who was really, really thinking about what is it like for a woman to be in a Black nationalist organization, to be around Pan-African thinkers who were also highly patriarchal. So for me, her work was very, very important to me. Rosalind Turbor Penn was also very important to me. As a young graduate student, I met her through ABWH. We weren't as big then. She was just delightful. I liked the fact that she was feisty. I loved the fact that she wore great hats. And she just kept her finger on me. And she reminded me that although it felt like my work was different from traditional Garvey scholars and different from traditional scholars of the Nation of Islam, that there was a place and space for it. I am so excited about all of these new books. My goodness, if you walk through whatever the floor where all of the books are out, I saw Michelle's new book. I was like, oh my gosh, people are tearing it up. When it comes to the direction of the field, I have to say, what I'm most excited about is how many of the archives now are digitized and how we have access to so much material. And that people now can kind of tap into and go places that otherwise we wouldn't have been able to do because we just didn't have the finances to do that. I'm also excited about the fact that more and more of us in the field understand the importance of us having multiple languages under our belt. Being able to read archives in Spanish and French, being able to understand that the diaspora is more than, you know, where we are. So I'm excited about the way in which we are expanding and looking at materials outside of the English language.
You know, we feel the same way about you and sitting on this panel. It's so awesome. I will resist the urge to echo some of the names that have already been called out, which are super important. And I think I'll share a little bit about some of the scholars whose work is coming out soon. Some of the junior scholars, some of them in the room. So I earned my PhD from Rutgers University under Deborah Gray White, who is a significant pioneer in the field of Black women's history, who trained so many different scholars. Amrita's not here, I think she left earlier, but her book just came out. Maya is sitting in the back there, Maya Carey, whose work will come out on girlhood. These are people who I am in conversation with, right? Like in these informal ways where we're talking about our work and we're stretching each other and pushing each other. Those conversations are so beneficial to my own work, but I think to their work as well, if I could speak for them. Philana Payton's work, who looks at Black stardom, completely different field, but she came to ABWH and she was like, oh, I get it now. I get what y'all do, right? So like we are pushing not just our field in history, but we're pushing folks outside of the field who are looking at us and understand what we do. And then they can use a different language, right? Like they can start to engage the archives in different ways and ask the questions that need to be asked in different ways. Then there's also activists who I'm in conversation with who also push me, right? So I'm thinking about Tondi Sizwe, who has a radio station on KPFK in Los Angeles. We talk a lot about Black radicalism, Black women, and she pushes me all the time. These are ways in which I'm continuously being influenced to think more clearly about the women that I'm interested in and how they are articulating a vision of freedom, how they are pushing back against capitalism, how they are constructing their own Black radical tradition. I want to also mention, I wrote a list of people, but of course, your work has been, you guys' work has been so instrumental to me. I am so honored to be on this panel. I just started reading your book, Dr. Kelly, and the way you talk about those washerwomen ironing those clothes as a skill. And I was like, oh, wow. Because I had never thought about it. You know what I mean? I didn't have to think about it. I'm thinking about plugging my iron in. And the way that you talk about no, right? Like, so, but the way that you write this narrative of these women with the iron in the fire and how they have to know how to take it off the fire and then crease them sheets and them undergarments to not burn them and to not, what'd you say, the little frown face or whatever? The cat. I was like, oh, and the writing. And I read Black women's history and I just get chills because like, ooh, if they ever get out of our way, okay? If they get out of our way, y'all, it's gonna be something. So I'll leave it there. But yes, I'm very excited about what's coming out, y'all.
All right. So I'm asking the next question, and it's, how do we consider the broader question of resistance? What does resistance among Black women look like over time? And what counts as resistance?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. Is this?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that question. I think about resistance quite a lot. I'm drawn to stories of resistance, especially from people who oftentimes do not have a lot of resources in a traditional sense, but have tons of resources in other ways. I like to think about resistance, collective resistance, organized resistance, the stories of organizations. I love to lift up histories of Black organizations, the ways that people have come together to chart a path towards a goal, and the ways in which they have, what they have been able to do, even in the face of resistance and repression, and even in the face of the ways in which internalized oppressions operate to keep people back, the ways in which they've been able to move forward. So thinking about the broader category of resistance, I always think about the collective and organization building. And it counters, I think, a narrative of individualism, whether it be individual oppression or even individual success or the individual ability to get ahead, right? And instead to think about peoplehood, you know, peoplehood and the ways in which we can think about Black people coming together to resist in that particular way. Now, amongst Black women, and especially in my own research, I think theory has been one way that Black women have resisted, theorizing, not necessarily in the ways that we think, not those big schools of thought that oftentimes are attached to well-known men. I'm talking about the everyday intelligences. I'm talking about the mother wit, the shared knowledge, the ways that people use common sense to challenge each other, the type of debates that go on within and amongst communities that result in new knowledge being created, new ways of doing and being. That's the kind of theory that Black women have been doing that oftentimes gets put outside, right, of the larger mainstream. So I'm interested in the intellectual history of Black women and how we can begin to uplift that, even when we talk about activist women, to think about it not just in terms of what they did, but also what they thought or the ideals behind that governed what they did, the why. Why did they do that? I heard Dr. Kelly say that just the other day. But the why, and to think about that why as a type of intelligence, as a type of knowledge, and to reclaim our treasures, reclaim and to see the ways in which Black women in community have been able to create models of resistance as well. And it's so important because oftentimes it may feel like the times were incredibly challenging, right? When you think about some of the moments in history that we may teach about to our students and some of the moments in, current events that we're living through, right? So this ability to find that wellspring to persist, whether it be through humor, whether it be through music, dance, the body, whether it be through creating a library that can free you, even when the society is telling you to know your place. Those are the ways that I think of we should be, I guess, positioning this larger question of resistance.
I really appreciate Professor Spencer Antoine's response here. I think that for me, in terms of what does resistance among Black women look like over time, that's a question that I've wrestled with in looking at women in the UNIA. First, because there's this assumption that the organization died at some point. It's still in existence, by the way. But really understanding that they evolved, that they morphed, that they blended with other organizations, and that they reappear in other social justice movements over time. And so understanding that, for me, brought me to this idea that resistance is really persistence. It's the pursuit of a goal. It's a willingness to not be tired, to not become exhausted. And it sort of encapsulated itself for me. In looking at, many of you may be familiar with Queen Mother Moore, Audley Moore. She was a Garveyite from New Orleans, and she lived into her 90s. And at the time of her death, she had been protesting. It's so ironic to be saying this here and now. She'd been protesting in New York City for the Board of Education to include African-American history as a part of the curriculum in celebration of Black History Month. And I'm saying that in Florida in this moment. Thank you, Mother Moore. And so understanding that for her, while she believed in Black autonomy and called herself a Garveyite, as the time period changed and people adapted Black power, as the time period changed and people said that they became American communists, she would find herself in that space and use that language, use that rhetoric to put forward the ideas that she held dear as a Garveyite. So she never actually moves away from the premise or from the goal, but she finds a way to refashion it for a next generation so that the conversation doesn't die or doesn't end. It continuously evolves. And I think that that in itself, understanding that we are a people who evolve, that we are not static, that we are not stuck, becomes essential to understanding what is Black women's history and how we become history makers, how we shape discourses and narratives. I also think for me, in documenting the women over time and even looking at Sylvia Woods' political career, her campaign, giving people credit for the work that they do and understanding that the work that they do that gives them a paycheck is only the start of the conversation about who they are. That the work that they do in their community, the work that they do as a part of social justice organizations, their church organizations, their fraternal organizations, is equally important and meaningful, because the work that they're employed to do that gives them a paycheck is what they use to fund these efforts, and they make a conscious decision to use that money in that way, even if it means that their kids only eat bread and butter sandwiches, you know, for 1 or 2 nights a week, but they're going to find the money to fund the jail bond. They're going to find the money to fund the Saturday school. They're going to find the money to print the leaflets to get the word out that we're having this meeting on a Wednesday night. And so giving people credit for work that they do then also forces me to get into language. What do we call it? What did they call themselves? Do the categories and paradigms that are established in the discipline at the moment really reflect the practical activist strategies of everyday Black women? Is this why they are not a part of the discourse? Because we haven't developed an avenue through which we can talk about them. And this is why the efficient womanhood became so important to me. And even when editors and reviewers and other scholars said to me, this don't make no sense, this don't make no sense, I kept saying, well, this is what they said about themselves. This is who they said they were. They said they were efficient women. And it is up to us to accept their self-definition and look at the record and the legacy. And sometimes the record that they left for me is their uniform. The record that they left for me is a song. The record that they left for me is actually the epitaph on their tombstone. And so being able to move myself in ways that says their ideas about resistance come not just through a written word, come just not through going to a march, come not just through writing a book or going to court, but in these everyday practical ways, actually having, you know, the insignia of the UNIA on your tombstone is an act of resistance. It's the idea that you refuse to have erased that you belong to this organization and that it was of value to you. And so even in your grave, I must give you credit for the work that you did in that way.
Resistance. I think for me, resistance is not always radical. It's not always trying to bring down capitalism. It's not always trying to disrupt patriarchy. And I think this is why sometimes people have difficulty with my work. Because I'm trying to figure out, how do women who are a part of an organization, who are a part of a movement, and I do agree with you, Robin, the importance of collective resistance. Oftentimes we feel like we have to carry the weight of it on our own. And when women come together in these organizations, they are clear that they want to do more than survive America.
Right.
They are clear that they want to figure out, how can I carve out space to thrive? How can I carve out space so that my children will have different experiences than I have had here in Jim Crow America? So for me, I think that for the women that I look at, they are women who are trying to figure out, how can I support my husband, my son, in a way that will allow me to stay home and be with my children and raise them on my own terms. That may not appear to be resistance to some, but for the women that I study, I understand it as that, because the other options would be for them to work in the homes of other people. The other options would be for them to work in the quote, quote, underground economy. The other options for them might be not to feel mentally and physically whole. So I try to think about resistance in a way that gives people room to make choices that go against my own feminist sensibilities. But it's a choice that I respect, and it's a choice that I have learned to find elements, aspects of it that remind me that we are all trying to be human on this earth in a way that brings pleasure, in a way that brings peace. And sometimes that's not tearing down the house. Okay.
I love that. I guess we've all been thinking about resistance, right? Like, that's so central to our work. I often get questions about resistance that don't always feel like it quite fits, right? Like, everything can't be resistance. But then that means we have to get clear about what we mean, have some precision in how we are talking about this concept. For me, what that has meant is looking at how other scholars have talked about armed resistance in the work, and then deciding that didn't work for me. And then coming up with something that works for me and for what I'm seeing in the archive. It's something I have my graduate students do. Like, let's sit down and kind of work through these definitions. We're just throwing out terms. Like, let's get clear. I look at armed resistance, and I think about it as the individual and collective use of force for protection, protest, and revolution, under which are several different types of armed resistance. So self-defense, retaliatory violence, rebellions, uprisings, revolutionary violence. That works for the work that I'm seeing, right? Because when I look at Ida B. Wells, who talks about the lynchings during Reconstruction, she's talking about, at one point, she suggests that people go, kind of burn this town down. that's retaliatory violence, right? Like that's not necessarily self-defense in the ways in which we might think of something automatic. If someone hits you, you automatically hit them back. So I think that the archives can help us to really think about what we mean by resistance and listening to the women that we deal with. But then I think the onus is on us to be really clear about what are these containers? You know what I mean? What works and what doesn't work, and how do we then deal with those contradictions? I love that Dr. Spencer Antoine talked about thinking like Black women as thinkers. Part of what my work looks at is Black women thinking about armed resistance, right? Like they understand that the odds are not always in their favor, but they say it's better to die than to die like a dog or a rat in a trap, which suggests that they understand what they are up against and that they are willing to fight anyway. I was reading the other book on, what is my girl's name? Unbought and Shirley Chisholm. There's a new biography on her and her run for president. Thank you. Please name her. But part of what she talks about is that run for presidency not being about like winning, right? Like, so what happens when we start to think about quote unquote failure in different ways, right? Like beyond like that we need to win, what do we gain when we say we're going to resist this, right? Like even if we don't win, quote unquote, what do we gain from that? And so that's some of the stuff that I've been thinking about. And then also, again, Nap Ministry, I love the way that she outlines, if you are not familiar with this, there's a podcast, I think there's a book that just came out. Again, please say her name. It's Trisha. Thank you. I love this. This is an informed audience, y'all. But I went and took a nap earlier too. I did because my body was like, go lay down. I was like, I'm going to lay down, right? And so living in a capitalist society that tells us that we need to be working constantly, we need to be producing constantly, that we are machines. I actually do think that when I go lay down, I don't know if I'm thinking about it as resistance, but I am thinking about it as me caring for myself and me understanding that like, I don't think God put me on this earth so that I could work a 9 to 5 and pay bills every single month paying bills. I don't know why this is the decision that we made about how we could organize society, y'all. Every single month. But so I do think that there's some space for us to think about resistance in these really interesting ways. And I like that the Nap Ministry, she's really outlining, right? Like she's outlining how Black folks were laborers and how our labor was extracted from sun up to sundown. And when we lay down, and when we rest, there's something that's important. The last thing I'll say is I feel like Preston talked about Mary McLeod Bethune, like going and taking a nap every day. I don't know if Ashley's in the room, but correct me if I'm wrong, but right, so let's start thinking about our leaders taking naps and resting. I think that that's really something important so that we can resist. I like the radical. I like my radical resistance. So we do need to tear the house down. But we can rest. We can rest in that process. So yeah.
Can I just ask something? That my current book is The Radical.
I know.
Yes.
Frances and Bill. She wants to tear the house down.
I'm
Yes.
excited about
She's
it.
going to tear it down.
I'm a host. After my nap.
Yeah.
Yes, I love it. Let's,
So for me, I think it's difficult to talk about resistance after all these brilliant scholars of resistance just gave all the answers I could think of to give. So I'm thinking here also about resisting categorization, resisting the labels that society might have for us as people who may not be appearing in any formal records anywhere, who may not be in formal leadership in those kinds of spaces. And yet their lives have meaning and their lives have things to teach us. I'm a fan of first lines of books being really powerful. I see a lot of books, and if you don't catch me, particularly if you're writing fiction or something I'm supposed to enjoy, if that first sentence isn't fire, then sometimes I'm like, oh, okay, let's do it anyway. So my very favorite first sentence, I'm going to paraphrase, I don't have it in front of me, but it's Chana Kylie's biography of Fannie Lou Hamer. Biographies of the poor make generous offerings. And so to look at a person like Fannie Lou Hamer and her contemporaries and her peers of other women from communities that we also oftentimes discount and forget, having those generous offerings in their stories. If we resist assuming that there's no meaning in their lives, if we resist assuming that because they didn't rise to this certain kind of level, there's nothing that they can teach us. I think it's really powerful. And I can't remember who mentioned failure. Robin, did you mention failure? I can't remember who said something about sort of threads of failures that they're so powerful for us to note those things too. My first book is full of an amazing generation of people who failed to change the world. They found no allies. There was no community to support them in challenging segregation in that first generation at the turn of the 20th century. And yet the things that they did, the ways that they resisted left trails, left breadcrumbs, left habits of life. Young people who I could find who said, well, we never rode that streetcar because, we fought that, we lost, but we never rode it again. And people who have memories mapped by the things that their folks fought against and never acquiesced, even if that not acquiescing can't even really be seen in the public. It's not something that they can note. So for me, those trails, those redefinitions, redefining what we mean by skill, it was such an important part of what I wanted to do in my last project. Technically none of my ancestors were skilled laborers, but that's ridiculous because if any of us, I can't press clothes with an iron that you plug into the wall. With like devices, I'm like burning my stuff. And my grandmother could press on coal with a piece of iron and not burn her clothes. She could do it so well, she could do it all day long. And so, my mother's memory of her mother, of her aunt, of her family members using that hot coal to cook, to bake cakes, to iron their clothes, and yet they weren't skilled. Is that what we want to say as scholars? Is that the way we want to think about their work? And so for me, our resistance as scholars, our resistance as people who are looking at the collective past is also tremendously important, and that we rethink every category, rethink the meaning that we find or others have not found in their lives.
My next question is about the archive, and I'm going to ask respondents to consider this as a lightning round, just to ensure that we have enough space at the end for the Q&A, because we do have another question after that. But we want to talk about the archive and how does the archive shape the work that you do?
So for me, the archive is only, the traditional archive is only a starting point. And I will say that the way that it shapes the work that I do is that it leaves me with questions that I have to now go and answer. Who is this and why is she only here as a footnote or on the side? And in so doing, I've had to build my own archive and fill in my own gaps and find these quote unquote alternate source spaces. Example, the FBI records on Marcus Garvey mentioned 1 or 2 times how the agents were afraid of Henrietta Vinton Davis. Unfortunately, Henrietta Vinton Davis never actually made it into the FBI files to tell me why they were afraid of her. So then I had to go and read some things in Panama and Costa Rica and Cuba to find out why they were so scared. And so in that way, the archive posed a question that led me to answers and expanded the way in which I did research. And the same is true for Anastasia Kerwood, who is the biographer of Shirley Chisholm, Black feminist politics. In the same way, we have the official political record, the official speeches, and then we have what Anastasia learned sitting in the room with Shirley Chisholm and her parents.
For me, I would just say archive is counterbalance. Archive is check. Archive is um, the digital archive that Dr. Taylor talked about, the accessibility of just checking and just seeing and just knowing. I'm a ancestry hound. Like I have, I guess, 26 different trees in Ancestry right now. I'll make a tree for anybody. Just come on up, I'll make you a tree. Because I think it's so powerful that I can just check and see. And then, but then I can see, you know, what you don't say, and I can see what you don't share. I can see what's missing over time. I can see who migrates. I can see who's not in that household that next time and never again. I can, you know, there's all kinds of things that you can see, but there's so much that's missing. There's so much that you have to go back and look again from a different way, a different angle, a different approach. But I love that rich retelling, that rich remaking that we can see in an archive, and trying to find those tiny threads that then give birth to something much bigger.
I would say the archive has taught me how to breathe deeply. And it has taught me to be patient. I think that one of the reasons why that a lot of people shun the archive, so to speak, is because it requires a certain kind of labor, a labor of isolation, a labor of your neck hurting because it's bent in a particular way, a labor that requires you to not feel the hunger pains in your stomach because you're trying to get as much work as you can done before they close the archive. So all of that has helped me to understand that good work is slow, okay, and that that's okay.
That was the gym for me because it's slow. It is slow. There was no ready-made archive for me in terms of Black women in armed resistance. It was very much, I think it started with me like looking in secondary sources because Black women are practicing and advocating armed resistance in plain sight all the time. And so then I'm like, all right, so now I can go here and I can find this and I can find that. So yes, you speak our truth in terms of learning the patience of the archive, but also what Dr. Kelly said about kind of crafting the archive you wanted to see, right? So like part of what I recognized in grad school was there was no ready-made, there was no repository for Black power oral histories, but there were over 1,000 for civil rights. Right? The Library of Congress being one of the largest ones, certainly. But there were oral histories with Black power activists, some of them misnamed as civil rights activists. That's a whole other kind of conversation. But it got me thinking like, well, you know, there's a reason why there was at no point, at that point, no kind of large repository of Black power archives, of oral histories of Black power activists rather. And I was like, all right, let's figure out how to make one, you know, like and so that's like one of my side projects, which is like creating this Black power digital archive. And it actually is in conversation with a few other different archives that do exist. There's one at Cal State Northridge. I think Derek is doing one in DC on DC activists. Certainly the SNCC Digital Archive is leading the way. Their project is really awesome. So I think that there's both a lack of, you know, kind of traditional archives, sometimes for radical resistance, but there are also these ways in which we are creating that. And that's really exciting. So I'm excited about that.
For me, the archive has been sometimes a spiritual space, you know, the souls in the archives, the things that the archives want you to find, want you to know, want you to share, the many stories of serendipity of I looked and it wasn't there and now it's here, or I couldn't believe I found this, or I looked and all of a sudden I see something else. I think we've all had those experiences in archives. I think that there's oftentimes for me like a call and response that happens in the archive where your research questions that you start out with become something totally different by the time the archive is done with you. It becomes another thing. And I've found myself thinking about the materiality of archival objects, the china, the silver, the record collections, the different ways that we can bring people to life. Because oftentimes we want that. We just don't want the public, person out there. We want that sort of interior person, understanding that it's the same person and we need to know all of it in order to tell that story. So to be attuned to the things you may not even want to see in the archive. You might go there for the radical books and encounter, this whole cookbook collection or knitting or other things that may not fit into what you think you're supposed to say. So the archives force you to listen.
Yes. And in that listening, Professor Eula, what do the histories of Black women and resistance, you think, brings to the crises and opportunities of this current moment in our history, in our time, in this space?
This is the big question, right? This is the big question. And it's our last formal question, and we're going to open it up to you. But I keep thinking about the Eyes on the Prize, where Diane Nash talks about the sit-in movement and how there was a constant flow of students replacing the original ones, and how, if you read deeper into the archives, as we just talked about, it became at times like a competition between Fiskites and Tennessee State and Vandy, Meharry. It became a competition between the Deltas, the AKAs, the Black fraternities and sororities. That is, people began to organize in their own small organizations for the larger movement, and how the replacement of bodies were clubs, were different campuses, and how oftentimes I think when we organize, we have to figure out how to bring everybody in. Sometimes I notice that we can be so critical of one another, because for those of us who are going to every meeting, we can be put off by those who come to one a month. And so if we have a little bit more patience with one another, that one a month person, so to speak, has a purpose and has a role. Their commitment might be different from yours, but the movement, particularly the way in which SNCC organized, I think is an important lesson that can be used in our current moment.
It is a big question, and it's one I struggle with. I mean, certainly, I think Black women know some things, so maybe we just listen to Black women sometimes, I think that the histories of Black women and resistance give us an opportunity to kind of go back and retrieve some ideas, right? Like there are ideas that Black women have put forward about how to change our society that may have gotten lost somewhere along the way that we might want to go back and retrieve, right? That's the beauty of writing the histories. I think, yeah, I'm still thinking on it, of course. Read Black women's history. How about that? Not only just cite, right? As Dr. Duncan said, because I think that that's important. Make sure you're reading it and engaging with it. I think that's very, very important. Some of what we are experiencing is not new. There are new challenges, certainly, but some of these questions are old questions, right? Like, as we know. So what then do we do with an old question that continues to come up? Like, what do we do with white violence that is continuously a part of this experience for Black folks here in the United States? And the women that I studied said, we need to fight back. And I'm not suggesting that you all fight back. But there might be something important about the way in which Black women, the Black women that I study, the Black women that I sit with, that I allowed to speak with me, understood white violence, vigilante violence, as a part of upholding white supremacy and domination and exploitation of their labor. And, you know, the conclusions that they came to after thinking and experiencing and examining what was happening with Black women for a very long time, and not just Black women, but Black communities. So that's not quite an answer, but maybe it's the beginning of something.
I think for me, the important thing in this moment is to remember our work, to remember the thing that we do, that we are engaged in our purpose about. I think Black women and their focus and their tenacity over time are a demonstration that we don't want the outside world to dictate our agendas. We don't want the outside world to always tell us, oh, this is the fire, go run to it, and spend the next year or two with this fire that I just said, and now I'm going to set this other one over here, now run over there. You know, the Toni Morrison quote that floats on social media about focusing on our work, about remembering the thing that we are called to do, and to be in our own purpose, and to not lose concentration on that. I think that when I look at Black women's histories, they're stick with it. They're focused on the thing that they want to build, and they're not looking to the left and to the right. You know, they're running their race, and they're, you know, not always completing it. Sometimes they got to pass it on to that next generation, but they are continuing to run that race, broadly writ. But I think not always responding to the pernicious thoughts of others that just want to keep us peddling again and again those same paths, not always having to answer every negative with our positive. Just let the work show, and let the work be the testimony about who we are as a people.
Yes. Two things come to mind. One is that I think Black women's histories and resistance movements oftentimes demonstrate to us that there's a struggle inside of the struggle. And we cannot forget that as we engage in and suit up and prepare to sort of think about the state structures. I think that Black women's history invites a look in the mirror to think about the relationships that you have, the things that you're okay with, the ways in which organizations work. How does patriarchy work or not work? How does heterosexism work or not work within the spaces that we find ourselves in? I think Black women's history of resistance has shown that there's oftentimes that duality in their struggles, from Ida B. Wells and the male ministers to women in the Black Panther Party to beyond. So I think we have to attend to that, especially as we think about organizing ourselves. And the second thing I think is to remember that we are teachers. Those of us here at Asalh, I think sometimes as professors, you know, we're doing all these other, you know, we're doing a lot of things. The term teacher, I think, does not seem to always sit comfortably with us. But the Black women who resisted, oftentimes, they didn't keep knowledge to themselves. They were out there sharing it. They were trying to influence others. These days, it can feel like being a teacher puts the type of spotlight that one would have never imagined, but at the same time has been such a part of the educational struggles, you know, in Black communities. So I do feel like thinking about ourselves academics, as teachers, and that could mean aligning yourself with not just ourselves in these conferences, but K to 12 educators, and to find out what can be done in our communities to support people who are simply trying to teach the accurate history of these United States and beyond, and to think about what support systems that we can be and the type of networks and how we just imagine ourselves in an educational landscape. I think that would be one thing to draw from Black women's histories of resistance.
So I am really grateful for the responses here, and I think that we've actually given quite a bit of food for thought. From my vantage point, the histories of Black women and resistance bring a lot to bear on the current moment. And I think about Premila Nasdin's work on Household Workers Unite. I think about Annalise Orlick's work on Storming Caesar's Palace, and the beauty of Black women who decide that the fight is not just theirs. The issues are not just theirs, that the questions that are posed to the Black community have an effect beyond us, and engage in forms of allyship and partnership that often is skewed from the view of this construction of what is civil rights, what is the long civil rights movement, because it's all crouched in these two terms of oppression and resistance. And there are limited definitions for those terms. And so when I look at Black women's history from an intergenerational standpoint, from a vantage point of allyship and the collective and how they define collective as a matter of concentric circles, that they moved in and out of spaces as those spaces served them toward their goal. They didn't just stay in one place. They didn't just join the Democratic Party and sit down and say, we're Democrats now. No, they went and they learned something from the communists, and they brought that back to the Democrats and say, are you willing to do this, right? They learned something from the Marxists, and they went to the communists and the Democrats and say, are you willing to do this? And this idea of being willing to explore and expand is what I think in this current moment, when we hear young people say, oh, you know, my Black Lives Matters movement is not your mother's civil rights movement, it's because they don't know the history. It's because they don't know that Gloria Richardson took her body and her hand and put it on a military officer's gun and said, I dare you today, because we came in peace, and so we expect you to behave in peace with us. And I think if we get to the point where Black women's history is not just Black women's history, it's United States history, it's diasporic history. Often I'm challenged by the presence of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf as a leading figure. I'm challenged by the women who have become prime minister and head of political parties in South Asia, throughout the Caribbean. And then I look at our United States, and, you know, we keep blundering on the gender question when it comes to leadership in the White House, when it comes to leadership on the Supreme Court. We seem to always have this issue, this question, this discomfort, particularly when it comes to women, and more specifically when it comes to Black women. And that's because we are still forced to this Western construct, I'm gonna get in trouble, of forcing our history to be on the side, an elective, a specialty, when actually we are very much so a large part of this narrative. We've been driving the bus and gassing it for quite a long time. This idea of Black women who go to the fish fry to raise money on a Saturday and a Sunday afternoon, we have to ask ourselves again, what is it that they're doing with those funds? Why is it that they're willing to make those sacrifices? What is actually on the line? And it's these larger political questions, it's these larger social questions, and those questions affect them because it affects the Black home. And really, for me, Black women's history is the history of the Black home. It is the history of the Black family, right? And this idea of Black autonomy is not one that is exclusive to us, but the importance of it for us and how it bears out into the larger world is really what is at the crux of our story. And so for me, in this moment, increasing awareness and telling our stories in ways that are practical and that are that can be absorbed quite readily, regardless of your age or your socioeconomic background, becomes critical.
We're going to segue into question and answer, but before we do that, I just want to offer out just a preliminary round of applause for the brilliance that we heard this afternoon. Right. So we have Darius over here who has the microphone ready. So we want to open up to audience questions and concerns. We'll take a couple of questions at a time to make sure that we get as many voices as possible. And remember that you can always come up to us afterwards. So let's leave this space for an actual query. We also want you to contemplate, what do you believe that Black women's history offers to this moment, right? So feel free to raise your hand if you have a question that you would like to offer out. And if there's another hand, as I said, we'll try to get one or two on the table at a time.
Hello, this was so wonderful. Thank you all for doing this. I just wanted to ask real quick, you all, with the exception of Dr. Duncan, you all are, the rest of you are mostly focused in the United States. So what kinds of conversations are you think we can provoke or get engaged with our sisters within the diaspora, right? With the our West African feminist scholars, the Afro-Latinx scholars, et cetera. What do you think would be a best way to try to invite them to the conversation? Oh, and before I sit down, my name is Latrice Donaldson. I am the membership director for the Association of Black Women Historians, ABWH. Feel free to join our wonderful organization and join the history that these women have so wonderfully demonstrated why it's important to be a part of ABWH. Okay, thank you.
So we have one question about the diaspora. Is there another question out there that we can get on the table? Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Leanna Looney. I'm with Berea College, African and African American Studies. I identify as a social scientist. I'll let you take it however you want to take it. Over the last 5 years or so, I'm really coming to value historical context, her historical context in my work. So if y'all could talk a little bit about how your work has informed social science, specifically things like Black education policy, protocol in classrooms, things like that. And then could you also tell us a little bit about like any coalition building you've done with social scientists with your work and how your work might inform those of us who are working with policy implementation?
Thank you. So that's a question about how our work has informed social science and policy, and any sort of bridges that can be built between communities. Do we have a third question?
Thank you so much for your delivery this evening or afternoon. I'm Lois Wilkins, and I'm approaching 70 years old. And I am mother of 4, all overachievers, authors and PhDs, and I'm curious, the confidence and the insightfulness that you've given us this evening. One thing I want to give some sensitivity to is that many of us who've traveled this earth in the challenges that we've had over the time. Um, there's so much information that you all are sharing with us. I'm wondering if any of your HBCUs has online research opportunities to try to do a line of sight from a freedom school with middle school and high schoolers into collegiate and even advanced degree programs.
Thank you. So that was a question about just information and research opportunities online, and how can we break down some of the barriers and to broaden where this information can go. And the example was given of freedom schools. Let's start with those. Yeah, we'll start with those and then we'll get another batch.
So for the first question, I would just simply say ASWAD, the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora. It's a wonderful conference, and it's a way for us to engage with other scholars who are working outside of the US.
Some of my best friends are social scientists, so I think that's wonderful. And for me, my favorite interlocutors are social scientists. Because they'll ask me very specific questions that really drill down into the detail of, what does something look like? What is a working class person who's making this much in 1900? What do they make? How much money is that now? And important questions about wealth over time and gentrification. And so I think some of the most exciting work that I've seen recently is from Black social scientists who are incorporating much of what historians have been building over the past 30 years to really tell a different story and to really push back in their disciplines to include the archival, to include the historical and what they're talking about. So I think there's a lot of wonderful intersections. I'm trying to write an article right now where I'm thinking in narrative about the wealth gap, but then I have to go back to my social scientist friend and be like, okay, let's make sure my numbers are good here too, because I think together we can make a powerful argument. So for me, disciplinary boundaries can trip us up. And if we have real problems that we need to solve, that interdisciplinary viewpoint is so powerful.
To answer the last question, presently, outside of the HBCU realm, but also free of cost and at his own grace, Brother Abdul Amat is running a 5-week Saturday class online via Zoom that explores African American history and social justice movements. So if you have time after, I can get your email and forward it to you. And that is something that also I will go on the record as an Asalh board member and say that we are also exploring how to make that a component of Asalh, something that we have on our website. That's an actual class that would go beyond the Black History Bulletin that we presently offer on a regular basis, as well as the Journal of African American History, which also serves as that kind of information education distilling space. To the question about the diaspora, one of the things that I hope for the future of Asalh is that here at our meeting, we start to create spaces that allow us to have presenters and panels. Here we are in Jacksonville, which is one of the, I would say, kernels of the Black diaspora, being a port city, and the state of Florida being having 30% of its population to be Afro-Latino. Latino persons, that is something that we as an organization need to also move forward to. But I also move forward in considering, but I also think that it has to do with how we are teaching history. And this is why I always raise up Dr. Rosalind Torborg Penn for this, because when she talked about African Americans women's history, she said Africana women's history. And Africana women's history was intended to include women across the geographic location, time, and space. And so I think it's incumbent upon us when we're doing our research to become more aware in terms of how we are creating context for how the intellectual development of our women come about, and recognize that they are also in conversation with women throughout the diaspora, that they're reading the same newspapers, that Jet magazine was circulating in the Caribbean and giving news and views there that reverberated back. The big thing in Jamaica was that here was Martin Luther King in Jamaica, in the magazine, in Ebony magazine. And it was such a big thing for us. It was better than anything the tourist board could ever come up with, right? And so recognizing for ourselves that these relationships exist and making it a part of our work, making it a part of the way we teach, making it a part of the way that we speak, right? Why can't a Black woman be president in the United States? Well, she's been prime minister in about 6 or 7 Caribbean islands. She done run an African nation already. So what's taking us so long? We supposed to be first world, third world leading us.
Thank you. Just a few comments that came to mind for me. I think that oftentimes we are trained to think of our work within borders. I think that's the reality. To get the type of language skill that Dr. Taylor talked about is performative. It's not something that is seen as a part of your arsenal unless you're on a particular trajectory. So definitely, I do think these diaspora engagements are so important for us to think about. Even U.S. Canada, even like I said, with my work in US, Vietnam, Afro-Asia. It's a whole world out there. And I feel like sometimes it can even feel intimidating and familiar to stay between. Of course, we're in a context where we're told they're different. No, we're us, they're them. I mean, I think we get that narrative all the time. These histories are very different. So we can't seem to think about the ways to bring it together in particular ways. But I think when you look at histories and the way that things travel, whether it be music, whether it be culture, whether it be newspapers, magazines, journals. I mean, the woman that I'm writing on, she had newspapers from all over the world, from Cuba, from Vietnam, from Uganda, all of that in her possession. So we know that there are circuits that were there, and we just have to, I think, open ourselves and challenge our colleagues, disciplines, and even the journals that we write to, or our work appears in, to kind of allow for that kind of global understanding. Any more questions from, I saw 3 hands here and 1 back there. We can probably get a trio of questions.
Hi, I'm a 4th year PhD student or a PhD candidate. And my work, I didn't think about it in this perspective, but my work is trying to have the historical record of the Black Lives Matter movement in Minneapolis, Minnesota, that is more accurate than how it has been framed, especially after 2020.
Right.
And so I've been questioning how my dissertation claims sometimes go against contemporary newspapers and contemporary ways in which everyone's rushing to get the story, because I'm working more so with the people. And I'm trying to figure out, like, as someone who's not at your position yet, but trying to get there, how do I negotiate making sure people see my claims as legitimate when sometimes they're still going against the archive and sometimes still going against, I don't know how, yeah. And I'm not a historian, but what I'm trying to write is for there to be a more people-centered understanding of what happened to us. And so a great example is even like preparing my presentation for Asalh, talking with one of the members who was in the organization that was a catalyst to a lot of what happened in 2020, and them correcting me to be like, you need to get it right. And I'm like, yeah, I want to get it right. But then as an academic, I'm thinking, how do I make sure this is published in the spaces for it to be consumed, when sometimes that might be up against other currents?
Thank you. So the question about Black Lives Matter archives from the bottom up and try to challenge and create space for particular narratives. Did you ever follow?
Hi, I just want to say thank you for this wonderful conversation. It's been very influential and helpful for me. And my question actually kind of dovetails nicely off of the previous comment. I myself am, my name is Chloe Porsche. I am a 6-year PhD candidate at UVA. And so I'm in listening to all of your stories and in listening to the ways in which you're trying to push the bounds and create new archives and redefine definitions that we previously have kind of restricted our ability to understand Black women's lives and the way Black women are resisting. I'm curious what advice you guys have for young scholars like myself and the other students, as well as some people who maybe even aren't at the stage but are interested in coming into the stage, when you are trying to write and create these new ways of thinking and ways of knowing, and you don't have the support around you. Like we have Asalh, which is, oh, I love it, so beautiful and nourishing. But when we don't have that immediate access to kind of this nourishing space, I'm curious what advice you guys have for young scholars, people who are trying to step into what it means to be a scholar. Because it's been 6 years for me and I'm like, oh, I'm just kind of realizing I can come into these spaces. So any advice you have would be greatly appreciated.
Thank you. So question about advice for graduate students who are trying to blossom in hostile soil and facing resistance on a very psychic level. Yeah. I think we have a third question. There was one there too.
Hi, my name is Renee Scott. I'm a PhD student in the Harriet Tubman Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Maryland. A mouthful, but I love the new name. I have a similar question, or similar to that, and also to your all's statements about archives. I'm curious about, I study play, and I'm curious at what point do you say you're looking for that needle in the haystack in the archive, and you're trying to find that someone else said it versus saying, well, taking the autoethnographic route and saying, I'm an authority figure here. I saw someone do this. I am a Black woman seeing this thing happening that is not in the formal archive. Thank you.
Thank you. I wasn't able to hear some of that fully. So if anyone wants to reiterate or if you want clarification.
I think she's sort of talking about when you know something and you can't find someone saying the thing you know, but you know. I think that's been really powerful for me in my last project to really lean into the stories of my people and the things that they taught me to know. And it's always been a script in my head as I did other work, like, you know, is this discernible to me from my ancestors' experiences? But then there's also times and ways in which things change pretty dramatically. And my own sense of what the issue might be is you know, being read through a filter that they may not have had. And so I think for me, it is important to sort of counterbalance those different ways of knowing, but to honor that the way that you know from your own experience, from your ancestors' experience, the things that were passed down to you, they're just as valid. And I think there are now models. There's so many great scholars who are using those other ways of knowing. Someone invoked Mothers of the Mind. That was really a starting point for me to say, I'm going to think differently. Because when I look at, you know, Elsa Barkley Brown's invocation of her mother and the ways in which that work site, that community, that wisdom that her mother had, it's informing her at every turn. And so I think citing that archive that we are now building of people who are willing to step out and counter the way that we're taught to do the work that discounts Black life, that discounts Black knowledge very actively, to strips it away from us, strips our voices and our knowledges away from us, to reassert and grab hold of those as best you can.
I'll speak to just the importance of creating support systems. So there's many graduate students here. Y'all need to meet each other, say hello, exchange information, set up a writing group via Zoom, join ABWH. Like the amount of many of us, I've been in pretty great spaces, I think. But again, Rutgers was like this amazing, dope space where like these Black women historians were all coming through and they were like pulling us aside and was like, okay, girl. And I understand that that's not everyone's experience, but you can create that, right? Like you can create spaces where you can have community with other scholars who will read your work. I used to have like a little system, right? Like I know my homegirls can read this when it's in its rawest stage, when I'm not feeling really comfortable about sending it to Deborah Gray White. Like I needed her to see the most polished version of it. So who are the people that you can, bounce really crappy ideas off of until they get refined? They're in the room. So make those connections with people here. And then as you do that, what is important is that you become that. Right? Like we can't just always have, be asking, but we also have to figure out like, how do we pull some people up when we're behind? So I do read people's stuff that's a little, because I mean, someone had to read mine and it was, it was rough. It was rough, but like, some people in here can write a draft and it be beautiful and amazing. That's not me. I need 18 different versions of it. But I will say that like, I think that those kinds of networks are super important. That becomes important not only for our writing, it becomes important when you go in the job market, right? Like you need to be able to talk to someone about how to negotiate because we don't always negotiate. And we need to negotiate for ourselves. That's very important. It becomes important when you are navigating departmental politics, whether you are a graduate student or not, because folks be having us messed up and you need your community. So I would suggest you start to build that community and genuine relationships. You know what I mean? Genuinely being able to call on folks and ask. I know we're running short on time. But.
So I want to answer both questions very succinctly. One, you're at this conference now, find 5 friends. I was at a conference and I wanted to go to dinner with Deborah Gray White and she told me, no, go find some friends because you're going to need them. Those 5 friends are now my writing group. Every other Friday, we meet and we write and we talk and we cry and we vet each other's work and we cry and we vet each other's work. And out of it, we now have full professor, 2 tenured professors, a dean, a person who is now on postdoc. And we are at different stages in our work. And so you build your own community within the academy. And that's the lesson that I learned from the Black women who I saw resist, that they created spaces through which they could thrive within and without of the institutions that were attempting to oppress them. The needle in the haystack, I am the poster child of that. There's a Guadalupean woman who wrote a letter to Calvin Coolidge, who nobody I know who works on Guadalupe could ever tell me anything about. And I decided that citing that she wrote to Coolidge and what she said was enough to make my point. And so there comes a point in the work where you say, here is my objective, and I'm leaving a breadcrumb for the next Hansel and Gretel to come and pick up, right? Because there's no dissertation like a done dissertation. A done dissertation is the best dissertation.
On that note, we want to thank you so much for engaging with us. We want to remind you to cite Black women, read Black women. Thank you so much.
And ABWH does have a morning writing group and ABWH has an evening writing group. So if anyone, and we don't limit ourselves by gender. If you're a scholar and you're looking for a safe space, please consider the Association of Black Women Historians, abwh.org.